Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Atlantic Council event on harnessing Allied space capabilities. My name is Matthew Kranig, and I'm Vice President and Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. This event launches the Scowcroft Center's newest paper series, which considers how U.S. strategy can best leverage the comparative advantages of allies and foreign-owned companies in the space domain. One of the United States' greatest strategic advantages is its robust network of alliances and partnerships. Yet strict regulation, overclassification, and other hurdles stand in the way of the United States fully realizing the potential contributions of allies and partners in the space domain. While we have seen some progress toward integrating allies, to include the Artemis program and just last week the News of Space Command's agreement to work more closely with key allies, there is room for greater levels of collaboration. How can the United States bring its allies and partners into the fold to achieve key security, commercial, and exploration objectives in the space domain? Our new paper series launched at today's event examines this topic, considering the current state of U.S. and allied coordination in space and opportunities for further collaboration and integration. Convenings on topics such as this are integral to the Scowcroft Center's mission of developing sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and its allies and partners. The Center honors General Brent Scowcroft's legacy of service and embodies his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, support for U.S. leadership and cooperation with allies and partners, and dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. Housed within the Scowcroft Center, our Forward Defense program focuses on generating ideas and connecting stakeholders in the defense ecosystem to promote an enduring military advantage for the United States, its allies, and partners. Today, we're very pleased to be joined by Dr. John Plumb, who will deliver keynote remarks. Dr. Plumb is the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy in the U.S. Department of Defense. He has served in various national security roles, both in and out of uniform for nearly 3 decades, with his prior experience ranging from the U.S. Navy to Congress to the White House. Following our keynote speaker, we'll be joined by a panel of the series authors: Nicholas Efthymiadis, a non-resident senior fellow with the Scowcroft Center's Forward Defense program and a professor at Penn State University; Robert Murray, a senior lecturer and director of the Global Innovation and Leadership program at Johns Hopkins University; and Dr. Tiffany Vora, a non-resident fellow at the Council's Geotech Center. Our panel will be moderated by Atlantic Council Board Director and Thales Chief Executive Officer, Alan Pellegrini. Alan, thank you for joining us today and for Thales' commitment to these important issues. Before we begin, I'd like to make a few housekeeping remarks. This event is public and on the record. We encourage our audience on Zoom to ask questions using the Q&A tab, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. Our moderator will be collecting these questions to be addressed by our panelists. Please be sure to identify your name and affiliation with each question you submit. We also encourage our audience to join the discussion on Twitter using the hashtag #ForwardDefense. Thank you again for joining us, and now without further ado, I'd like to turn to Dr. Plumb. Dr. Plumb, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Matt, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to the Atlantic Council for putting on an important event like this today. Allies and partners are essential to the President's national security strategy. They're also essential to our national defense strategy. So it should really come as no surprise that they're critical in the space domain as well. So just for a kind of a scene set here, in the Obama administration, I got to work pretty extensively with Ambassador Sandy Vershbow. He had been the ambassador to NATO and to Russia. And when I worked with him, he was Assistant Secretary of Defense with a heavy Europe focus, as you all know. And I learned from him the approach to allies and partners that I feel like it was just true, and I've carried it with me to this day, which is we're all in this together. And in space, it's particularly true because we're all in this together, perhaps by shared interests, common threats, but also by physics. And just as an example, if an orbit is destroyed by debris, for example, that affects every spacefaring nation that's trying to operate in that portion of the domain. So as I've been reflecting on how to approach this set of remarks, I've just really been struck by how much we are all in this together when it comes to space. So the department's thinking hard about how to harness allied space capabilities. But before I get to that, I thought I'd just take a few minutes to paint the broader picture of how we got here and where we're heading. It's an incredible time to be working on space issues here at the department. National security space has undergone massive organizational shifts since 2019. We've stood up a unified combatant command and space command. We set up the Space Force. We've got an Assistant Secretary of the Air Force dedicated to space acquisition, and we've got me, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy. So I'm the senior civilian in the Office of Secretary of Defense for oversight of space warfighting policy. This is a huge overhaul of national security space, and it was based on the recognition that our competitors had turned space into a warfighting domain, and that we as a department need to move faster. We need to get out of our own way in order to address these challenges. Space plays a critical role in our nation's security, in our prosperity, in our way of life, and it's essential to the Department of Defense for how we compete and fight in every single domain: land, sea, air. It provides us with missile warning and tracking to defend the homeland. It provides position, navigation, and timing to strike targets. It provides communication in austere environments all around the world to support command and control. Space is essential to the U.S. way of fighting and the U.S. way of war. Our competitors know this. They're fielding increasingly complex capabilities that can deny space-based missions of the joint force, and to deny those missions to our allies and partners. In just the last few years, the quantity and quality of counter space threats has increased significantly. We're in a state of intense competition with China. And of course, we're seeing that play out in space as we are in other domains. We're going to protect and defend our national security interests in space. We're going to protect and defend our men and women in harm's way from space-enabled threats. That's our job. But I do want to make something clear as we go through this speech too, which is that conflict with China is not inevitable. Conflict in space is not inevitable. And frankly, the more we can rely on our allies and partners to increase our deterrence architecture, I think the further away that type of conflict will be. And that really leads me to our real focus, which is how to deter conflict. And from my job, one of it, at least for space, it's how to deter that conflict in space. There's a lot of parts to that answer. But as I've been reviewing what I've been doing the last year and where we should be headed, I'll just say again that what we need to do is normalize space as an operational domain so we can unlock the ability to compete in that domain well, unlock the ability to cooperate with allies and partners in that domain well. Space is becoming democratized. There's civil craft, there's military craft, there's commercial craft in space. Some is crewed, some is uncrewed, most is uncrewed, let's be honest. But it's not just governments and it's not just major corporations. Universities fly CubeSats. Really, if you can afford a CubeSat and a ride share, you can be in space now, and that's really amazing. And so everyone needs to adjust, and the DoD is one of the biggest actors in space, needs to adjust to how this domain works with a large and increasing number of other actors. Just like we've done in the air domain, just like we've done in the sea domain, just like we've done on land for years and years and years. Now, for DoD, one of the things that's going to mean is we can't rely on large, exquisite systems in the geobelt as our only solution anymore. It also means we can't have a go-it-alone approach. And that's where allies and partners really do come in. And of course, it also means, and Matt mentioned this at the top, that we can no longer classify space-related information to the point that it limits our ability to operate with allies and partners. And the other thing, and this is true for all of our like-thinking nations, to normalize space as an operational domain, we all need to be able to provide frame of reference for our national security leaders who've all spent most of their careers considering air, sea, and land. Until very recently, space has really just been the dominion of a few nations, and people who have grown up doing national security for whatever nation they work for have come up in that frame where it's land, it's sea, it's air. How do you use these different domains? And cyber is a new domain and space is a new domain, and both of these need to be increasingly calculated for and understood. And I believe that the sooner we stop treating space as a unique domain, or as a unique domain that is different, that requires special handling, any of the special caveats we put on it, the faster we can treat it like any other domain, the faster we'll be able to make better progress. And that includes with our allies and partners on deterring conflict in space, with the goal of preserving a secure and stable space environment. So how can we get about working more closely on space with our allies and partners? First of all, like I just said, cooperation with like-minded nations contributes to our collective ability to deter aggression. Cooperation broadens the number of systems available for space operations. It enhances resilience, and it expands options for diplomatic or military responses. So DoD is strengthening space partnerships both bilaterally and multilaterally. NATO has recently established a space center. The Combined Space Operations Initiative, or CSPO, is a body that I'm really proud to be part of. And representatives of the 7 members of CSPO just met last week on the margin of the Space Symposium. And we are pushing the boundaries of what space cooperation with an allied by design framework can achieve. My office is currently drafting a new international space cooperation strategy. This will be DoD's second one. Will help focus the department's international engagements on space with an eye to achieving meaningful results. It'll include areas like resilience, include areas like interoperability. Each nation brings its own capabilities to the table and has their own national security interests in space. And it's only through sustained engagement that we are able to identify where we have capability gaps and how the alliance or how different allies can complement each other. Now, governments are not the only users of space. Value of the international space economy was around $470 billion in 2021, and it's clearly poised to keep growing. Commercial space industry is a major driver of economic growth and innovation. Commercial space is increasingly benefiting the lives of people around the world on a daily basis, increasingly benefiting the lives of Americans, and it's making significant contributions to our national security. When we look at Ukraine, we've seen how commercial space systems, for instance, imagery or communication services, have really been essential to Ukraine's effort to withstand Russia's unjustified and illegal war of aggression. And we're also learning tangible lessons in real time about how those capabilities can augment national security and national security decision-making in crisis and conflict. The president's national security strategy and the Biden administration's national defense strategy both give the department what we consider a mandate to increase collaboration, not just with allies and partners, but also with the commercial space industry. How do we leverage technological advancement or allied and partner capabilities to enable our own or to augment the group? And just as one example on the commercial side, a fun example is space mobility and logistics, and it's fun because the Department of Defense doesn't have refuel tank in space. We don't have any on-orbit services to replenish satellites when they run low on fuel. The commercial sector is working on that. And since it turns out fuel can be a limiting factor in the operational life of a satellite, the idea that there's a whole capability out there waiting to help augment our ability to do national security, to me, is just really interesting. And just on the commercial piece, we've kicked off a series of efforts to chart a path forward for partnering more closely with commercial space industry. So really what I'm saying is we're pushing on the allies and partners piece. We're pushing on the commercial space piece, really under that same kind of theory, which we're all in this together. And our goal overall is to streamline our ability as a Department of Defense to work with partners to ultimately enhance U.S. national security. And so I'd like to just touch on classification as well, because it comes up in every single hearing I go to. And so it's on the minds of almost anyone that's working on these topics. Space is overclassified. We have classification policies for space-related information, and those policies are based on legacy information sharing agreements. And when I say legacy, you have to think back to pieces of paper moving around. But those policies are slowing us down in an information age. Our allies and partners can provide an enduring strength and an asymmetric advantage that our competitors can never hope to match, but that's only true if we're able to utilize that advantage. We can't do combined space operations at an operationally relevant speed if we can't share classified information with allies and partners that they need to do those operations at an operationally relevant speed. Similarly, we can't partner effectively with commercial space providers if we can't provide them with timely threat information due to classification concerns. And our defense industrial base partners tell us that overclassification or more restrictive processes for protecting is just costing us time and money. And what I've learned in my job in the last couple of years is we also struggle to align our own efforts in the U.S. government because sometimes overclassification prevents key stakeholders from being able to communicate effectively or prevents their staff from being able to prepare effectively. So normalizing space as an operational domain requires a better ability to share classified information and to reduce some of these self-imposed barriers. And we are working really hard on that. We are at a pivotal moment in space. It's a period of transition. We're adjusting the proliferation of space actors. We're adjusting the proliferation of the use of space as a military enabler. But one thing is certain, we can't keep space as a safe, stable, and secure domain on our own. So we're going to need to work with our allies and partners, just like we do in the land and air and sea, and we're going to have to do it in a meaningful, sustained way. And the last piece of that puzzle is we need our best and brightest, not only driving space innovation and scientific discovery, but also helping our nation navigate new policy territory. Regulatory challenges over dual-use technologies and security dilemmas over how to protect allied interests. These are all problems we need to address. Putting these ideas front and center will require more events like this one today and more thought leadership, including from the panel you're going to hear next, because we really are all in this together. It's not just allies and partners, it's the entire community that's interested in preserving a safe and stable environment. So really, thank you to the Atlantic Council for having me today. It's a great event. I really do appreciate this opportunity. I'm sorry I could only do it virtually, but thanks to everyone for joining, and I hope the panel goes great. So thanks.
Great. So hello, everybody. I'm Alan Pellegrini, North American CEO for Thales. I want to thank the Atlantic Council, Matt, for hosting this event today, and especially thank Dr. Plum for his keynote address, which I think sets the table exactly as we like it for today. Many of you know Thales as a global aerospace and defense company. This includes in space, where we are one of the world leaders across telecommunications, across exploration, across science, and across national security space with both satellite and other space solutions. So as a result, we are extremely pleased to have the opportunity to sponsor this event today with the Atlantic Council and giving me the opportunity to host this panel today. So the panelists who you heard introduced drafted three what I believe are excellent papers addressing the broad topic of allied cooperation in space, but each brought a unique perspective to their work. We saw Nick bring attention to the topic of national security, which we'll explore. We saw Rob talk about the extent of commercialization and privatization impacting space, and Dr. Vora, Tiffany brought an exploration perspective to the work. So my goal is to try to extract and get the panelists to elaborate on some of their key points and themes they expressed in their work. I want to say the timing of this discussion, I believe, is excellent, not just for all the urgent reasons that Dr. Plum laid out, but last week, some of you, like me, may have attended the Space Symposium show in Colorado Springs. This is an event that brings together not just U.S., but world leaders who are driving the space agenda, both from a military and a civil perspective. So many of us are fresh with the views of these national leaders, and today we're going to benefit from the views of our panelists. So what I'd like to do now is just start with some introductory comments, and Rob, perhaps I can start with you, but if you don't mind just sharing a few words and filling in a few blanks on your background you brought to this project, and add any other introductory comments you'd like, you can kick us off.
Be delighted to. Thanks, Alan. And many thanks to the Forward Defence team here at Atlantic Council for putting this all together and the hard work that they've done there. So at the moment, I am a senior lecturer at Johns Hopkins University, and I teach innovation, leadership, and management there. Prior to that, I spent the last 10 years or so in Brussels on the Secretary General's staff at NATO headquarters, where I had a number of roles associated to various sort of capability developments in the intelligence realm, in the maritime and land activities, and The last couple of years was spent very much looking at innovation when I became the head of innovation. And that really drove the policy activity around emerging and disruptive technologies, of which clearly there are many, including space, and looking at how as an alliance we may wish to think about space and actually what it means within the context of NATO. Prior to the decade or so in Brussels, I was a British Army officer for about 12 years. So that's me.
Great. Thanks, Rob. How about Nick?
I spent, well, first off, thanks to the Atlantic Council for actually tolerating me through the entire editing process. But that said, I spent 34 years in the U.S. intelligence community. 7 of those I spent with the National Security Space Office doing generation after next integrated national security space architectures. Retired in 2017 after 34 years. I accepted an appointment to the Defense Science Board, where I also worked a bit on this issue. I was also appointed to the Homeland Security Advisory Council and Economic Security Subcommittee, and I'm an advisor to the DNI on space issues, or to the National Intelligence Council. I am a full-time professor of Homeland Security at Penn State University, and there I focus a lot on emerging threats and disruptive technologies.
Great. Thank you, Nick. And finally, Dr. Vora, Tiffany, perhaps you can share a few words to get us going.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for having me here and having had me be part of this process. It's been a really remarkable journey bringing these articles out into the world. So I'm coming to you today from my home in California. I live in Silicon Valley. I'm actually a molecular biologist by training. I've had a career time in both industry and academia in the United States and internationally. These days, I'm a fellow at the Geotech Center for the Atlantic Council, and I also work with institutions like I'm the vice chair of digital biology and medicine at Singularity University and faculty at EY's Tech University. And I'm fortunate enough to get invitations from folks like Homeland Security and Defense who asked me to come down to the Naval Postgraduate School and speak to their rising leaders as well. So I sit right at the nexus of technology, the future, innovation, science, and leadership, like the other members of this wonderful panel that we have today. And for me, the mindset is all about building the future. So for the work that I do in space, I'm a board member at Explore Mars. I'm also part of Humanity in Deep Space. A lot of what we're thinking about is what is the future that we're trying to build here? And how are we going to do that today? What decisions do we need to make today in order to bias the future in favor of the outcomes that we actually want, a peaceful, prosperous future for as many people as possible? So that's the angle that I was bringing to the exploration article for this series. How are we going to build that future starting today?
Okay, great, Tiffany. And obviously we can see we have a panel that's well qualified to tackle the points we're going to get into. So let's dive into it. I want to start with the broad topic of space exploration. To me, we are in the midst of a renaissance in exploration right now that frankly is as exciting as the era I grew up in with Mercury and Gemini and Apollo. And some of you, may be of the same era and remember when Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. And for me, it was an inspirational moment that I truly believe propelled me into a career in aerospace. And, last week I had the opportunity to hear NASA Deputy Administrator Pam Melroy outline this next phase of space exploration, not just through Artemis and going back to the moon, but going beyond to Mars. And it's not just a matter of returning for a visit like we did in the 60s and 70s. It's a matter of establishing permanent establishment for productive means. So I find it personally extremely exciting. Tiffany, you wrote the paper around exploration. I'd like to get more of your insights and thoughts on kind of the state of exploration today and what excites you about it.
I'm excited about everything about it, which was why I was so delighted. Like you, I grew up with space being something that was inspirational. I remember when I was younger, standing in my backyard in Florida and watching space shuttle launches from the backyard. This is going on in my neighborhood. It was a really exciting time. And The fact that now I can steer my 11-year-old son in front of the television over and over to see these amazing things that are happening, I think is fantastic. So as you mentioned, there's the Moon to Mars roadmap for for establishing a sustainable human presence on the moon and also on Mars. But that's the kind of exciting, flashy part of it. And it's so important that we do this work. There's also really exciting exploration going on with uncrewed missions, robotic missions, looking beyond Mars to other parts of the solar system. And of course, if we want to push the envelope of where exploration can take us in terms of fundamental scientific knowledge about the universe around us, then we can look even further to exoplanets and distant galaxies and all these things. So it's really an exciting time that this is happening. And I think that the rise of commercial space, which Rob is going to tell us much more about, is both a driving factor here, but it's also a beautiful virtual cycle. I think of exploration as being the leading edge of driving the expansion of human knowledge, right? It's hard, it's really expensive. It requires extraordinary interdisciplinary, international cooperation in order to do exploration, to get it done, not just the logistics, but to do the science as well. And the more systems and processes that we have in place that support that sophisticated, cutting edge, dynamic collaboration, the better we are going to be at continuing to harvest knowledge from the universe around us and turn that into products and services that make the world around us, that make our daily lives better, more secure, and more prosperous, not just for Americans, but for folks all over the world.
Great, Tiffany. And I resonate with what you said about uncrewed missions. You know, too often I think, of course, we're fascinated by the bright, shiny man back to the moon and Mars missions, but so much is also done in science that we don't want to lose sight of and is equally as inspirational. But you also started to touch on a point I want to get into, which was really foundational for the work you all did, which is that of allied collaboration. When at Space Symposium last week, it wasn't just Pam Melroy and NASA on stage. She was joined by the head of the European Space Agency, the head of the Canadian Space Agency, the head of the Japan Space Agency, and other allied space organizations. So talk to us a little bit in the context of exploration and science, how that collaboration is going. And you might touch on topics around Artemis or Moon Mars, but also I'm very interested in areas of like climate science, where perhaps the alignment between our allies in Europe, especially in here, aren't quite the same. So, Dr. Vora?
Great. This is a wonderful topic for us to dive into. So I love what you said about the multiple space agencies working on these exploration initiatives. If you take a look at the exploration article that is coming out today, there's a beautiful graphic of concept art from NASA, which shows the Gateway module, which is a component of the Artemis program that helps. You can think of it as kind of the last mile of delivery for getting people and cargo to and from the lunar surface and lunar orbit, between those two things. And so if you look at that concept art, it's really emblematic, I think, of what's going on in exploration today. So you can see components that are coming from NASA, from ESA, from JAXA, from CSA. That's fantastic. You've got SpaceX on there, right, which is emblematic of new space. You've got legacy, really established hitters in the space like Northrop Grumman on there. And then my actual favorite part of that diagram is the airlock module, which is labeled TBD, right? Contributor TBD. And there's been talk recently about perhaps the UAE Space Agency being a contributor to that airlock module. So again, everything we can see here is showing that it's public and private. It's established companies and up-and-coming companies. And it's the folks with the track record of success as space agencies, and also these kind of rising space powers that are in various parts of the world that historically were not part of these earlier space initiatives or space races, if you will. So I think that is a really wonderful example of that's only just one component of the Moon to Mars roadmap. The further out we look, the more we're going to need to be looking at these public and private bodies, new players, established players. All of that is the ecosystem that comes together. Now, as we heard from Dr. Plum in the keynote talking, though, what that means is that if we're going to work with these allies across these really complex initiatives, we've got to be able to share information. We've got to be able to share personnel. We've got to have reciprocity in our relationships with them. And I think it's important for the United States to stay a trusted partner in this new space that we're building together. But that means that's on us to behave again with our systems and our processes and our people that actually make that collaboration happen. We want our allies to come to us because America is great to work with. And that's where I think we can really dive in some more in the panel today.
All right, thanks, Tiffany. I love that you brought up the Lunar Gateway as an example in the area of collaboration, both with private enterprise and with allied governments. The Gateway is kind of near and dear to our heart. We are working with Northrop Grumman on the main living module called HALO. We're also working with our European Space Agency on what's known as IHAB, which is another living quarters, and other aspects of the Gateway. For those of you that don't know, the Gateway is basically a space station that will permanently orbit the moon instead of Earth and serve literally as that gateway between planet Earth to those working on the moon. So very exciting stuff. You know, I want to change themes a little bit to commercialization, but before I do, Tiffany, you know, brought up some very good insight relative to exploration. I mean, Rob or Nick, anything you wanted to add to that topic before I transition?
Well, just very briefly,
Yeah.
I think, and just to sort of put on what Tiffany said there, when we think about the fundamental science that needs to go in with regards to exploration, and we take into account what Dr. Plum said in his opening remarks about the challenges and difficulties of sharing information among allies. Actually, that notion of working together at a sort of scientific level, arguably, and I think the International Space Station demonstrates this, makes it a little bit easier to do that sort of collaboration and to some extent. So that to me is a really important point, and it goes back to actually political ambition. Right? If we think all the way back to 1962, we think about Kennedy's famous speech launching the Apollo program, a man on the moon by the end of the decade. Nobody in NASA at that point had any clue how to do the engineering to make that happen. But there was a clear political ambition. Obviously, the context of the Cold War was what it was. But I think that we don't necessarily have that level of political leadership at the moment in terms of clarity of ambition, to be able to sort of really gather together allies to then drill into that scientific activities and exploration and so on and so forth. So I feel that that's a very sort of big picture abstract point, but it's something which is quite fundamental, to getting this going. No, I really relate to that because, as I said in my opening comments, I mean, I wasn't quite born when President Kennedy delivered that famous address, but certainly saw the aftermath of that, and he really did have the ability to rally a nation around a vision and a cause. Are we at that state? I don't know. A lot of exciting things going on, but has the nation really rallied around these topics? I don't know yet. Nick, anything you want to add to this subject, or you want to?
Well, I'll just note on Kennedy that he initially wanted to work with the Russians, and the Congress shot him down.
Interesting.
That's dead on arrival. So, so that's one thing. Yeah, but I would agree with you 100%. And it's not just a little easier to share, it's a whole lot easier to share and to work collaboratively in a scientific and commercial environment than it is in the construct that we have for a defense and intelligence environment in space. Okay. Good. So now let's kind of bring in the theme of commercialization. And, of course, we're going to talk about it. It's not, space has to some extent been commercialized for a long time. I mean, telecommunication providers, move information and data and video around all the time, and they're privately run businesses. But I do think it is taking kind of that next leap or next step. And, again, I think back to last week when we heard a lot about the concept of commercial LEO destinations, which is really about what will be next after the International Space Station is going to be decommissioned in 2030 by NASA and the allies. This was a government-sponsored space station with very little commercial aspect to it.
the idea, the vision is to replace it with space stations, 1, 2, multiple, by private industry that are going to launch these for science and for commercial enterprise. And the broader concept around this is called the LEO economy, low Earth orbit economy. So I find that it's a really interesting concept. So the commercialization of space, it feels like it's going to become real, and we see a lot of enterprises now looking to address it. But Rob, let's turn to you. What do you see as kind of the future of commercialization in space? I mean, do we envision a future where you know there's manufacturing facilities and sites in outer space?
Yeah, I think, I mean, let's perhaps, if I can, Alan, maybe just take a couple of steps back a little bit within this, because I feel one area that really needs to be understood properly when we're talking about commercialization in space is money and capital, and where those capital flows are coming from. And if we were to look back, going back to the early 1960s after Sputnik in 57, you would see that the United States spent about twice as much as business on space technologies in GDP terms. So the US spent roughly about 1.8% of its GDP on space R&D in particular. So public sector was up here, private sector was down here. If we fast forward that to today, that has totally flipped. And so what we're seeing now is that businesses spend around about 3 times as much as the government on technological development for commercialization. So what does that mean when we think about NASA, for example, in a US context? Well, it means that NASA is now not really a supervisor of activities being produced and made, but more a customer and a partner. Now that's okay. I think that's not necessarily an issue, but it does mean that if we were to kind of think about space technologies and kind of split them in 2, so we have kind of our upstream activities and our downstream activities. So if we were to sort of broadly define upstream as those sort of manufacturing and launch capability and sort of ground control station type bits and pieces, things which traditionally governments would lean into quite heavily. And then the downstream activities, more about space-based operations and services, so sort of imagery coming down and communications, very much that commercialization. Well, we're seeing those lines blur a lot more. Now, that is driving a lot of the commercialization, which is coming about, and I'll come on to some specifics in a second. And really, when we see those lines blurring, it leads, and I think it will lead into Nick's work, it leads into questions about, okay, how comfortable are we with regards to really that whole low Earth orbit becoming pretty much commercialized? Because when you talk about manufacturing and so forth, there are some amazing technologies that our allies are leaning into. I look to Belgium, I look to IMEC, one of the facilities there. They, for example, are working on microgravity bits and pieces, which looks to minimize those gravitational forces. And what does that mean? It means, you can start to produce goods in space that either you can't do on Earth, or you produce them to a much higher quality than could be conducted on Earth. So, things like drug compound production, target receptor discovery, fabrication of silicon wafers and so forth. So manufacturing in space is coming, no question. You can see the technology going there, you can see the money going there as well. I think the question becomes well, if we kind of create the low Earth orbit as a market per se, and it'll just allow market forces to carry on, things like public goods, such as national security, such as foundational science, such as national pride, quite frankly, they will often, they're classic market failures, right, when you see these markets produce. So therefore, one has to sort of understand, okay, how far do you want this relationship to go with regards to commercialization of space? There's huge benefits that go with it, huge wider potential as shoebox satellites go up, provide communications for the global south, for people that don't have the internet. I think what we're going to see, just last point on this, is that over the next few years, through the communications capability alone of having networks through space, you're almost going to see, I'll say the global south just for ease, those regions of the world who perhaps don't have easy access to the internet today. It's almost like going to be going back 25 years when the internet really sort of came into our lives and a whole digital economy came about. We're going to see that again, and it's going to be in parts of sort of Africa, bits of Asia, bits of South America, driven by space-based capabilities. And that economic activity that's going to go on there is going to absolutely wildly change our sort of economic endeavors and prosperity globally.
So it sounds like you're suggesting, a revolution in terms of private or commercial enterprise in space is coming. It's happening, but at the same time, it seems you're advising a little bit of caution that there is still a role for nations and national space policy to have a significant role in it, and we need to work to find that balance. Is that fair?
I think it's a very reasonable summary, and I suspect Nick's probably got some thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, and I want to bring you into this, Nick. So let's stick with kind of the topic or the theme of commercialization, but let's turn over to national security space with that regard. At Space Symposium, General Dickinson, who is the commander of U.S. Space Command, as you know, he discussed the progress and the status of the Space Force and its current operations. It was interesting, I found in this talk, he took the time to highlight multiple examples using the Ukraine war as the backdrop of where commercial enterprise had an impact on the conduct of that war in aid of the Ukrainians. And he gave a couple specific examples I liked. One was around imagery or Earth observation and surveillance data, not provided by traditional government satellites, but by commercial space, who were able to very quickly provide useful information that could help the Ukrainians not just in their fight and defense, but also in debunking Russian information that they were putting out, trying to portray the Ukrainians in a bad light. I thought that was very interesting that he felt private enterprise had a big role in that. And the other example is a bit more common that we've read about in the headlines, which is from a communication perspective, a reliance on commercial low Earth orbit constellations like Starlink that are able to provide a higher level of resiliency than perhaps national government assets are, and also were able to help the Ukrainians. So Nick, talk about that. I mean, commercialization and national security don't always go together in the same sentence. How is that going to play out?
It's kind of funny we've wound up here in this position. I can remember decades going back, NASA Administrator Sean O'Keefe talking about the idea of developing low Earth orbit and then turning that over to private industry, and then NASA then moving out into space. That was a theme for NASA for 10 years. In the 90s, we talked about the sky going black with remote sensing satellites because commercial idea of remote sensing was just kicking in. And then we had this extraordinary advance in technology, in miniaturization, in capability, in launch. All those things start to rush in. And we meet somewhere around 2015, somewhere around this thing, with all these forces coming together to create and about 500 million people rising into the middle class globally, right? Largest portion of which is in China and Southeast Asia. So all these forces that are coming from different angles hit to one point where space now becomes, I can remember the days we used to fight with terrestrial communications, debating where were you going to bet on, space or terrestrial communications. But now it's clearly space. Private industry has jumped on this. We have not gotten to a point where in U.S. private industry, particularly in the comms or in the remote sensing, where they're independent of government money, right? Because we're still at the genesis of kicking this off. But that shapes the security environment. All these forces that I've brought into play shapes the security environment. And that nexus between commercialization of space and national security interests is going to be something we're figuring out for the next decade. I mean, it has everything from operational security implications for forces all over the world, ours and everybody else's, to cost considerations, to how you do your acquisition processes. I mean, all this is going to change. When I looked at this problem set, I saw, okay, understanding this strategic environment, particularly the population curves and things that occur over decades, as we look at allies, there's some benefits, great benefits. And some are what I call hard benefits. You could actually say, hey, they can bring this capability to the table, and that can augment here, and that can integrate there, great things. Japan putting up a missile defense, a satellite system, small sat system. You can, those are hardwire things you can talk about. And then there are some soft things, like our geopolitical situation, our codes of conduct, our behavior globally in space that are a little more difficult to put your finger on, but nonetheless, we can. There are those benefits that working with allies as well. Okay, great. We got benefits. Now we got challenges. So it all doesn't work that easy. And so what we find ourselves wrestling just from this commercial explosion in space is these extraordinary set of challenges in being able to do that in an operationally effective time frame, because we do have other nations that we have to consider that don't have our best interests at heart. So it's a great time of turmoil, I think, in the defense commercial relationship.
Yeah, good answer on that. You touched on the topic, you brought in the allies into the discussion, so let me expand on that with you, Nick. Do you feel at this point, I mean, we see everything that the Space Force through the Space Development Agency is now doing to acquire and build out their architecture to protect our country and potentially our allies. Do you feel we're maximizing, are the nations working closely enough together from a national security space perspective to really optimize the synergies among us? Are there complementary investments going on, or is every nation kind of going alone at this point and worrying about their own sovereignty?
So the answer to your question is somewhat of a painful one, to be honest, because there's, we talk about doing things, and I have learned over 3 decades of looking at this, I push that aside and say, okay, what have we actually accomplished? Okay, I don't want to hear about we're going to do this and we're going to do that, because I've heard it for 30 years. I hear some of the same statements now on things that I said in 2006 and 2007. Extraordinary, but we haven't done them yet. So lots of people jump on that. We're doing this, we're doing that. We need to evaluate our success in terms of what we have done and accomplished. And if you look at it that way, the record is a little more mixed in integrating or collaborating with allies, and a little more than it should be. I mean, no slight to the department. Everyone's doing God's work, running ahead, charging ahead, and doing the right things. But we're still not making progress. We're swimming in our own bureaucracy.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. One bit of progress I would suggest is, as the U.S. at least is building out its own constellations for national security space, I do believe they're sincere about looking towards allied companies, not just companies like Thales, but others in the world who have technology that perhaps could benefit the U.S. So I think to that extent, they're at least not necessarily standing in the way of trying to get the best solutions at the best price for the taxpayers. But I'm interested, now that we've explored these topics a bit, privatization. Let's talk about the government's role then. As we move forward, the U.S. government, whether it was NASA or the Department of Defense, was always, out in front, defining the vision, defining the programs, contracting with entities to move forward. How does the government's role evolve in this new paradigm with more private venture going on? And maybe I'll turn back to kind of the commercial or exploration and science side of things. Tiffany, I mean, how does NASA's role change? How does ESA's role change as we move forward?
Well, I think these government agencies have a very important role as the earliest or sometimes sole clients for these products and services that are going into exploration, right? There's often, it's just them. And so that is a really important thing, where the government is basically serving as an incubator for these various commercial capabilities. Now, in our interviews with several experts over the preparation for the research time that we did for these articles, several of the experts made the statement to us that it would be great for these space agencies to provide that early incubation and then to get out of commercial's way, which I thought was a very interesting way of thinking about it. I mean, fundamentally, you could think of government and commercial as working on very different timelines, right? Government is taking the long view. Commercial has got a much tighter and faster development and go-to-market cycle than government would have. And I think both of these actors have a really important role to play in order to keep innovation moving forward, to get us to these products and services that are actually going to make life better for us on Earth as well as on space. But I think that it's easy to, especially when we're talking about innovation in business ecosystems, to undersell the real importance of fundamental science. And to me, that's where government is going to continue to play a really strong role. You know, if we think of any of these evolutions of these developments being, you know, you take a scientific problem, you turn it into an engineering problem, and then you turn it into a business problem, right? The government is really strong in that phase one, that fundamental science is so important for us to keep doing.
Yeah, and you brought up science again, and I wanted to go back to that with you, Tiffany. You know, in addition to exploration, you know, I think of a topic like climate science as being so foundational to what our space agencies help drive. I mean, we as an organization are involved in a number of initiatives with the European Space Agency and NASA in terms of monitoring all aspects of climate and our oceans, with very important results that are coming out of that. But do you see? Let me go back to the point. Do you see good alignment? Try to be a little provocative here between the U.S. and our allies. I mean, do our allies put more weight or emphasis on things like climate science than the U.S., or do you feel the U.S. is pulling its weight there too?
I think the U.S. has the infrastructure in place, like you're saying, the imaging that we need, the analyses that we need, to be able to get the data that we need in order to make science-informed policy decisions. I think we are doing a good work there. And I think, though, the magnitude of the challenge with climate change is such that we cannot afford to say, we're America, we've got this, we don't need any help. Totally not true. And also, let's remember that looking forward, the countries that are going to be most impacted by climate change are not necessarily the countries that have access to these capabilities that we're talking about, at least at this moment. So for the United States to be a world leader in the fight against climate change, which I would really like to know that we're doing from a policy perspective, from a technology perspective, from a market perspective, I think we can do that. But again, it's going to be about a coalition of partners around the world who have various technological capabilities, are looking in different places, in the ocean, in the air, in the ground. You know, how is agriculture being affected? How is conflict being managed? All of these things, to me, come back to climate, which is, I think, a point that I would just love to insert right here. So for me, when you're working on a climate problem, you're also working on a space problem. To me, these are not just like the same technologies, but it's fundamentally the same issue. How do we continue to live sustainably and prosper and grow as a species in a complex ecosystem? So whenever I hear folks are working on space habitation modules, I'm like, awesome, you're looking on closed loop environments. Why don't we talk about how your learnings could go for low resource settings here on Earth, or when climate change is kicking in worse? How are we going to make those changes? Biotechnology, you know, that's my background. How are things like synthetic biology, which I believe are going to be key to space exploration, human space exploration in particular? How can we take all of those learnings and deploy them here on Earth as we face this massive climate crisis? And so again, like for me, this is another place where commercial is just a really strong partner here. So that when we're looking at, is the US pulling its weight? We're not just talking about NASA and NOAA and, you know, these other great organizations. We're talking about American business. And to me, the more minds we have working on these big problems, the better we are, the more creativity, the more problem solving we have. So I would say, you know, I'm gonna give the United States a gold star, but we can't let up. We've got so much more we can be doing.
Okay, so you've made some good points there. The fact that there are missions that the U.S. and other nations have that, to some extent, we can't wait for there to be a business case and for private enterprise to go tackle, climate science being one of them. So the role of government and our space agencies is still prominent and very important, even if private enterprise is a strong partner along the way. Let me stick with the topic of the government's role, but from a national security space perspective. So as we hear about imagery and geospatial analysis companies, we're part of one called Black Sky that does good work for the U.S. government now. Maxar has a significant business as well. How does the government's role, from owning and operating these assets to working with private enterprise to build out and operate these services? Nick?
Well, I think actually you sort of just explained it. The government starts to pull back from its, in this case, if you want to talk about remote sensing, its national systems. It allows it to focus its national systems, because systems are always overtasked, right? And then it allows us to take lots of missions, which are often military support, as well as other, issues that are security related, but military support functions that don't have the type of NIRS, the imagery interpretability scale, don't have the type of exacting requirements that you do in other national security systems. So the beauty of that is that you can, I'll use the term offload, or you can task, or you can buy those as commercial assets. And if you're really smart about it, you can get the government's hands out of it so much and allow a distribution network to occur, even to warfighter support to people that are on the ground. Right? So the government is still charting this course, but it needs to more and more cut a wedge out too, because everyone fights over money in the government. You need to cut a wedge out for your private support and ensure that that's being taken care of on a different level and save your national assets for use. Theoretically, the money towards national assets should start to go down. Because you're not using them as much. You should not build into that. The vast majority of the requirements that are needed for national security today, the majority can be serviced by commercial providers. Interesting,
and you touched on an aspect that I think Tiffany did as well, which the government still has this important role of, let's say, being a launch customer or early adopter in order to continue to be a catalyst for private enterprise. In the case of defense, Nick, you point out that a certain segment of the budget for imagery type data should be allocated to these types of private enterprises. In the case of exploration and science, again, I go back to the commercial LEO economy. I think unless these companies that are going to build these space stations orbiting the Earth get some money as an ongoing customer for a while from NASA and the U.S. government, they will not have a business case for those investments either. So I think that is an important role that governments will play. So Rob,
and it's a role that government has played in so many other spheres, everything from the computer mouse to to so many other technologies, as being the initial investor for promising technologies. I advocate a lot the In-Q-Tel model, which the government has put a lot of investments in, and then on a ratio now of 18-to-1 gets venture capital coming in to support those investments as well.
Okay, well, great analogy. So I mean, this isn't necessarily new for the governments to have to play this role. But Rob, on this topic, let me give you the last opportunity to comment. So we've talked about the government's role, whether it be in exploration or science or in national security space. Do you have a perspective about how the government's role is evolving?
Yeah, so maybe I can try and just bring some of these themes together a little bit. I think that when we say the government, obviously that is quite a broad church, to say the least. So I think that to your earlier question, Alan, about, okay, how collaborative has NASA and ESA and all the other sort of space agencies around the globe and with allies, how collaborative have they been and are they? Then generally speaking, that is a well-trodden path, going back to all the work that Tiffany's described with regards to scientific activity and exploration. When we think about defense and national security and those elements that Nick's been talking about, that perhaps in a US context takes us to the DoD, takes us to Space Force. Well, of course, not every ally has a Space Force. So therefore, by definition, there's not going to be a wild amount of collaboration because there's not a huge amount of people to collaborate with. So I think one needs to just understand that, and it goes back to to Dr. Plum's remarks about NATO opening its sort of space center of excellence. And let's be honest, for some of those small European countries, the probability of them creating a space force, I think, is probably quite low. So we need to be just a little bit cognizant of when we say how much collaboration is going on with government. Okay, what do we actually mean by that? I think the other point where government has a real role to play with regards to low Earth orbit is about getting a grip of these negative externalities that the market is bringing about. So what do I mean by that? I mean that if we were to go back and look at the industrial age and look at all of the pollution that comes about from combustion engines and everything else sort of associated to that, the government generally, or governments generally, will step in and put policies in place or taxes or whatever it might be to try to minimize those negative externalities because clearly they're not priced in to anyone's pricing model. We can apply that same principle to space and the externality there being debris. So there's clearly a role for government to play in trying to, because the market's not going to fix that problem by itself, I don't think, not for a little while yet. So there's a clear role there for government to have some sort of policy lead. I think that the notion, though, of all of the fundamental activities with regards to foundational research and exploration, which ultimately leads to, eventually at least, commercialization and business cases, I think we want to try to step away from the notion that you socialize the risks and you privatize the rewards. So in other words, the taxpayer picks up all the tab to kind of take all the risk and the uncertainty, to get technology to a certain point of maturity, and then that's all captured through perhaps grant money or whatever it is to companies, and then companies collect those rewards. Nick's spot on when he talks about In-Q-Tel. For those perhaps that don't know, In-Q-Tel is an intelligence community's venture capital arm, started off through the Central Intelligence Agency. And fundamentally, what you've got there is a genuine opportunity where you put taxpayers' money into new technologies that not only have huge commercial, well, most of them have decent commercial application, those that succeed, but they also have the secondary market of the government. So the point being is, you're not actually socializing the risks and privatizing the rewards. You are getting that money back, and that ratio of 18:1 is spot on. So I think that there are ways in which we can think about the role of government with regards to space and the growing commercialization of it, and how one wishes to involve oneself in it. Last point from me is just going back to the notion of sort of climate science and the role of space and the United States in particular. I mean, I think as a Brit, I can probably say this. I don't vote in this country, so I don't really have I don't have a political stance on this. But the United States is the hegemon. All right, it is the world leader of the political West. This is with a capital P at the biggest level, political problem, in so much as, okay, where do you put your stake in the ground with regards to climate? How much of an issue do you make of that? And obviously there's an impact there with space and so forth. And because that is a politically difficult discussion for various reasons, I would be a little harsher when grading the United States, and maybe go from a gold to perhaps a silver star. I think there can be more done at
Room
political
for
level.
improvement, perhaps.
So you can speak to my students. I'm a harsh grader. Yeah.
No, I'm glad you brought
but
that.
But I think from like a strategy perspective, your point's really important, Rob. Right? Like we don't have the alignment in the United States that we need to have, like compared to some of our European counterparts. We just don't have it. And so as you're saying, politicizing this issue with a capital P, if that is what it takes to motivate us to get together, to get behind these really long-term strategic investments and commitments that we need to make, yes, I will go with your silver star rating on that. In terms of strategy, we're still not nailing that. And we have the opportunity here to do better.
Yeah, as I'm glad you brought in a European perspective. As a European headquartered company in Paris, whenever I meet with my colleagues there, I would think they would agree with you that they feel Europe is a bit more out in front than the U.S. for sure, and it's still it's a political debate here in the U.S.
And I'm glad that you still consider Britain part of Europe.
Well, I was going to ask you.
I was going to ask
My question was going to be, do you still consider it?
Absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely.
Good,
Yeah.
good. All right, so I'm going to come back to you, Rob. So take a breath, but this is an important question to me. You know, a few years. I'm going to stick with commercialization. A few years ago, or longer, we've been seeing a lot of venture capital and other money pour into new space, so-called new space, and we as a company made our investments and bets as well in young, really inspiring organization. But times change, inflation and interest rates have gone up. Venture capital is starting to realize that space isn't a short-term thing. You got to be in it for the long term when you're investing in space. And I think we're starting to see a bit of the money dry up, and it's leaving some of these entrepreneurial companies left dangling a bit, even if they have very strong ideas and concepts. You know, Virgin Galactic was one kind of high-profile example of that recently as they filed for bankruptcy. But what's your view on that? I mean, how are the capital markets and the economy in general gonna strangle or not what's going on in private space?
Well, thanks for bringing up the British failure there of the Galactic, but that's fine. But no, I think in serious terms, this is a really important point because it goes back to the very first thing I was talking about with regards to capital flows. So if we accept the premise, and you're absolutely right, Alan, that the majority of financing going into these young, agile startup companies, but also the bigger ones as well, your SpaceXs, your Virgin Galactic, and so forth, that is coming from the private sector. It's coming from the venture capital world. And so one has to ask, are the incentives aligned there with regards to perhaps those wider government incentives? And so let me explain what I mean by that. If we think back to a year or so ago when I think it was the digital minister of Ukraine put a tweet out asking for help with internet and so forth, and Elon Musk basically put Starlink in place. You've got critical national infrastructure being provided in a war zone at the whim of a billionaire. And so I think, it's about coherence and it's about policies. Like, okay, are we comfortable with that? Maybe we are, in which case, no problem. But going back to the point about money and incentives, it's like, where are our incentives aligned with this? Because what we saw, I did some research on this when I was still in Brussels at NATO. What we saw during COVID, when it came to venture capital funds, was when you had that sort of systemic uncertainty, the VC funds just basically did a big pause on investing. But companies, particularly deep technology companies, space-type companies, they need that capital in order to, at the moment, it's still an expensive business. They need that capital. Well, if you're not going to get it from, let's say, for argument's sake, US VC firms, well, you're going to turn elsewhere. All right, you're going to look to other VC firms, maybe in China, maybe elsewhere. The point being, actually, in times of systemic risk, and I'll just use COVID as the example, and the data supports this, it actually creates a strategic risk. Because suddenly you've got a sector that is being commercialized, it's being heavily privatized, thus dependent upon private money. But, and right now we're seeing another shock, although not quite as quickly with regards to inflation as you alluded to. And we're seeing actually, a lot of VC round, we're starting to see down rounds now. We're starting to see the level of diligence going through with regards to space companies way higher than it was a year or so ago. All right, so what does all of that mean? It means that there is a role for government here because government can do one thing which private money cannot do. Right? Government won't take risk. It's going to go beyond risk, and it's going to dive into the world of uncertainty. Why? Because governments tend not to go bankrupt, unless you're Argentina. Right? So the point being,
for our Argentinian
apologies
friends in the audience.
But the point being is that risk can be measured. If we were in a corporate finance class right now, we would have sorts of fancy models measuring it. Uncertainty can't be, and that's where governments need to go. All right, and so this notion that you can privatize the entirety of the space sector, actually to provide both upstream and downstream assets, capabilities, call them what you will, I don't think is credible. There is a role there for government, but it comes back to how you align those incentives, and quite frankly, how you make sure you don't socialize all the risk and privatize all of the rewards.
Yeah. I think you brought in a great point about the strategic impact, because it's not just a financial or economic issue, because there are opportunities for investment, and these companies are going to seek money outside of Western organizations. We think about China or the Middle East or other areas, which may be okay, but it may also be risky. But Argentina can say they won the World Cup, though.
Yeah, well, exactly. That's
which English?
Let's not
England
talk about that.
All right.
So, yeah.
We have about 5 minutes before we open it up for questions, and there's one more really important topic I want us all to spend a little time on, because we've talked about allied cooperation and collaboration. Of course, the flip side of that story is what happens with our potential adversaries or competition. And of course, I'm thinking about Russia and China. I'd like to get all three of your views, maybe starting with you, Nick, from a national security perspective. Are we in another space race at this point? Is it U.S. and its Western allies against China and Russia?
I think that's fairly well established, at least in doctrine, discussion, and practice. You certainly see it on the Chinese side, in their writings. And, truth be told, in the Pentagon, it's, as they say, China all day, every day. So whether or not people come out and openly admit it, I think those camps have fairly well settled into moving in those directions. And China is far more the long-term strategic threat than is Russia at this point. So the answer to your question is, yeah, I think forces have settled into that.
Do you see China and Russia actually partnering, though, collaborating to the extent that we and, let's say, our European allies might?
Well, sometimes there's things they say, and sometimes there are things they do. I think 2 years ago or so, maybe more, they inked an agreement for the moon, to work and to move towards the moon. Since the Ukraine invasion, that has suddenly gone silent, so we don't know what the long-term effects will be. But I think they're in partnership. There are a lot of problems between the two, right? They don't see eye to eye on everything. There are a lot of concerns on both sides. I'll say paranoia, but there are legitimate concerns on both sides. But that being the case, they're close. China's gotten early on a lot of Russian technology for space programs, and now it's sort of advanced and carried itself well past that. So, but I think they're going to be far more cooperative in space than they would be, ignoring each other or something.
Okay. So interesting. And Tiffany, I'd like to get your views, I guess, more from a science and exploration perspective. One of the immediate negative impacts of the Russian-Ukraine conflict was of course, Russia extracting themselves from a very important scientific mission, ExoMars, which was a revisit to Mars with uncrewed landers. Thales as a company was part of that initiative, and it really set it back a couple of years as our allies, the Europeans, scraped and found a way to carry out the mission going forward without the Russians. But it always struck me, space always seemed like a global force for good. The Russians were a big part of the International Space Station. We relied on them, as our allies did, for launch capacity. So it's been very disruptive. We've heard from Nick on kind of the national security implications, but talk to us just from a science and exploration perspective. Are we forever not going to be working, or for the foreseeable future not working with the Russians or Chinese?
Well, I'm also a yes on whether we're in a new space race, so I'll just put that right out there. And interestingly, as one of the experts that I've talked to during my research said, this is our race to lose. So really, I think we have some really wonderful advantages with our allied ecosystem in terms of winning this race. We can define that however we like. But I think it's also important to remember that these foundational technologies and science that we're talking about here, computation, MEMS, robotics, autonomous systems, AI, biotechnology, materials, all of these things that feed into that. China also is hitting the gas on their investments in those foundational technologies, not only for space, but also for life on Earth. So I do think we're in a race. I think we are in a race for exploration. I think I agree with that statement that it's our race to lose. There are quite a number of outcomes that could lead to the United States not being the first, let's say the first on Mars, or not the United States, but our allied coalition with the United States as a trusted partner being the first to put humans on Mars. I mean, that could happen from catastrophic mission failures to unexpected Chinese successes to even things like lacking the political will to actually get this done. And so that's why a lot of the work that I do is about finding these other cases for why exploration matters and why it matters for us to be in this competition, this race to win. I get asked all the time, why should we spend money on space exploration when we have so many problems here on Earth? And to me, that's a false choice, because the space race, for me, is also the race for the future here on Earth.
Yeah, I mean, a very good point. It makes me think of something you said earlier, Rob, just about the, do we have the leadership that is going to motivate and inspire the masses to really rally around it? It amazes me. I think of the Artemis program as an example. We're going back to the moon, yet how many people I run into have no idea what Artemis is? I mean, for me, it's one of the most exciting things we are doing right now, and brings me back to my childhood when we went the first time. And there's a lot of people today that don't seem to know who Neil Armstrong was or what the Artemis program is. So I do think that if we are in a space race, as you agree, that it is important that as a nation, as nations, we rally around it. So we are exactly at 3:15, so we are on time, and we had reserved 15 minutes or so for Q&A for our panelists. So for those of you that are watching virtually, I do hope you take the opportunity to send your questions in. I think I'll have a chance to see them here on the screen. But if we also have some questions from the audience, now is the time to stand up to the podium and let us hear them. We have somebody approaching now. Please let us know who you are and ask your question.
Thank you. My name is Nicholas Nunez. I'm an intern with the Fuller Defense Program for the Governmental Center and Strategy. Hello. Thank you. Sorry about that. My name is Nicholas Nunez. I'm an intern with the Fuller Defense Program for the Governmental Center for Security and Strategy here at the Atlantic Council. And my question is, all of the authors here have discussed the capabilities of our allies and partners and the benefits they can bring to U.S. space security. But how do the U.S. and allied policies compare to, say, China? And they have one of the fastest growing startup communities with roughly 100 new space arms this year. Are they doing things the U.S. and the EU should be doing differently? What can we learn from them?
Great question. I had a chance to be in China not too long ago and firsthand kind of touch some of the startup community. Really impressive, or also perhaps a little scary at the same time. But which one of you would like to tackle that? Okay, Nick,
I'm happy to
start
jump
us
on
off.
it, but I'm actually interested in hearing Rob if you wanted to. The U.S. and China's approaches towards space and commercial space are dramatically different. And I'll give you an example. Under the Belt and Road Initiative, China has what's called the Space Information Corridor. And they also have a digital Silk Road. So dozens of countries, over 100 countries, are part of that Belt and Road Initiative, and almost that many are part of the digital Silk Road, meaning China is doing all the digital works and setting up, facial recognition programs, safe cities programs, safe policing programs, et cetera, okay? All that data flows through China's Space Information Corridor. China provides that service, and at just an absolute minimum cost. You can actually look in Chinese media as they're selling their national remote sensing capabilities for everything from telemedicine to security issues to peacekeeping missions, et cetera. So China, I find a hard way of doing this, but saying this, but they actually democratize space, providing inexpensive government space services for the entire planet, or in this case for the entire emerging world. The fact of the matter is that they're the beneficiaries of being able to collect and have all that data, but it's an extraordinary way of just integrating and putting your fingers all over the planet and providing through space data. Now we see them still well behind the U.S. in the small sat commercializations program, Guam being their primary one, national network things. But they're gaining. They're gaining, and their vision is to catch up with it. But they have taken it on at a national level, and that's the key point.
Right.
Yeah, maybe I can just build on Nick's point. Thank you, Nicholas, for the question. I think actually it goes back to what we were talking about earlier on with regards to, are we in a space race? And I would suggest that what we're in right now is a space technology adoption race. Now, what does that mean? What do I mean by that? I mean that actually, given and what Nick said earlier about how the vast majority of sort of government needs with regards to space, you can capture through commercial bits and pieces. But there was a report just out last week in the US by the Government Accountability Office, which basically said, look, the Department of Defense just isn't doing a good enough job with regards to pulling in collateral data from commercial entities, and there's more work to be done there. And so it goes back to this point, okay, well, right, well, if we're in a race, and at the moment, and we're kind of looking at the sort of the immediacy, is how we adopt the commercial activity. I think the US, as the government side at least, still has quite a lot of work to do there. What China is doing is that actually, because they are significantly subsidizing the sort of upstream activities and the launches and so on and so forth, they're able to really accelerate their market and create all of these commercial activities and space sort of capabilities. And so the question is, okay, how do they get leveraged by the state? And yeah, why not? Is there areas by which, quite frankly, our bureaucracies can learn from that? And it's a similar, I mean, in terms of like commercial activity, and not security now, but commercial activity, it's a similar perspective in India as well. So India are doing very similar things to China in this regard. And yeah, we should be looking at these countries as to how they are leveraging those commercial assets, because that, quite frankly, is the race, in my opinion at least, that we're in right now.
And this actually comes under China's military civil fusion program. Yeah. So it's a very, very focused effort towards doing exactly that.
Yeah. Thanks for your question, Nicholas. Tiffany, I want to direct a question that came over online to you, and it has two parts to it, two related parts. First off, we've talked about going back to the moon, but has anybody actually thought about the rules of engagement or the policies? I mean, what do we all do when we show up and the Russians and the Chinese? How do we behave or act? And second part of the question is, these are lofty objectives: the moon, Mars, etc. But what do we have what do we stand to gain from it in a more near term? And you had alluded to that earlier, that there's benefits of space to society. Maybe you can address those two parts of the question.
Great. So the foundational text right now that we're working on for how we operate on the moon and Mars is the Artemis Accords, which is a pretty high level document that lays out things like conflict resolution, not in any detail, but like a commitment to deconfliction, to signatories working together on these things, rules about what a rescue mission looks like, these kinds of various pieces. There are about 23 signatories for that as of the last time I checked. But of course, neither Russia nor China have signed or appear likely to sign the Artemis Accords. And this is a big problem because, as we know, this type of thing is, we could see these activities happening in the next 2 years, right, where we have these folks back. Another big hole in the Artemis Accords is commercial. There aren't commercial signatories. All the signatories right now are government. So one of our experts pointed out that there could potentially be commercial extraction going on of resources on the lunar surface within the next 2 or 3 years even. And none of this has been laid out. I mean, we saw a glimpse of this again at the Ukraine conflict when a private company stepped in, basically providing communication services to one of those combatants. What does that look like on the moon? We don't have any real framework for that. And that is something as well when we're talking about this long-term strategic vision that really needs to be worked out. I really think that not only do governments need to come together, allied governments need to come together to figure out what is our long-term space strategy, what are we actually designing for, but getting the commercial sector in there as well is going to be so important because of how important and how quickly the commercial sector is moving for the moon. And I also believe for Mars. I do believe there are business cases to be made here, which will lead us to this next question you asked, kind of what are the benefits? Why should we do this? So from a scientific and technological perspective, folks are making arguments about things like minerals and metals that we could extract through mining to use for types of manufacturing or other things. Rob alluded to things like drug development in space, protein crystallography. There's a bunch of interesting stuff that's going on there. There's been some fun work that I enjoy seeing where folks are using things like microfluidics technology for biomedicine. Some of that testing is being done on the ISS to find out how can we harness microgravity to make these technologies better, but also to learn more about what happens to the human body in space. So we have all this promise. And then what we know today, of course, is that our whole lives, our modern lives, there's no such thing as a day without space today. So it's up to us and up to the companies that are out there to be figuring out what can we take from the moon and the Mars efforts that we're doing now that are going to transform life on Earth. And it doesn't have to be something physical like a mineral or a metal. It could be autonomous control of robotics, for example, for telemedicine or remote mining or something like that. There's lots of threads that we could be pulling on here to get that going. I'm really excited by that potential. And as we talked about earlier, climate change, the lessons that we have for climate change, all of the work that we're doing for Moon and Mars, how can we translate that as well into applications here on Earth to fight against climate change? It's all about sustainability. It's all about prosperity. It's all about circular economies. The bioeconomy is something that's getting a lot of press today, thanks to some of the Biden administration's acts. And there are other countries as well that are really looking on the bioeconomy. You can hear my bias, right? Clearly, I believe that space exploration matters, and it matters to life on Earth, and it matters to life on Earth for millions and millions, if not billions of people. We are the innovators who get to close those gaps and figure out how exactly we can get the most out of these efforts.
Thanks, Tiffany. I totally agree with you. It's just you said it a lot more eloquently than I could. I do think space matters. Look, we only have a few minutes. We have time for one more question. I thought I saw somebody else in the room who might want to run up to the microphone and just tell us who you are and ask your question to the panelists, please.
Yes, hi, my name is Dahardy Manson. I'm a program assistant here at the Atlantic Council. And my question is, you've spoken a lot about the benefits and necessity of the United States having an allied approach to space. What risks does the United States face from collaboration among adversarial nations such as China and Russia in the same domain?
Yes, we touched on this a little bit, but perhaps you can expand a little bit on the question.
I'm not quite sure I understand the question. What do you mean, what risks? You mean as far as space, counter space type things, physical things, or? So
you spoke a lot about how the United States needs to be a leader in having an allied approach to space collaboration, but what should we do if the United States is falls behind in this effort, and instead you see adversaries such as China, Russia, or Iran create this kind of block of their own alliance in space, and they're the first to have these sort of systems or collaboration there.
It's back to the space race topic.
Yeah, I'm not a particularly strong believer that the U.S. is doing very well in this environment, nor do I have a lot of confidence over the next 10 years we're going to. Tiffany's always eager to point out my philosophy that I think we're going to be losing space superiority as we know it over the course of the next decade or so. And, then the question is, what's a day without space look like after that? What if you can't rely on your financial transactions? What if you can't rely on your communications? What if you can't rely on the GPS signals that get you from A to B every day? I mean, that's what's at stake. And the question is how much and how fast can we incorporate our allies and to present united front, to use a Chinese term, present a united front to secure our future in space.
Yeah. So Nick, you've really, kind of, I guess, painted a picture. There's urgency behind this this topic, and I think introduced the term space superiority, which, historically we've associated with the sea or with the air, but now it's about space, and you alluded to the consequences if we don't have that. I don't think people at large genuinely appreciate it, and I think we all need to. Look, unfortunately, we are coming to the end of our time. So let me first thank our audience here who joined us live and in person, but also thank our virtual audience. And I do apologize, there were a number of great questions that came in online that we weren't able to get to. But most importantly, let me thank our panelists. Really appreciated your insights and your perspectives, and probably most importantly, the passion that you all bring to this topic of space. Look, clearly we've embarked on the next chapter of humanity and space. At Thales, we're proud to be a part of this. I think we're pleased that the Atlantic Council and other organizations are putting a spotlight on it. It is essential that we as a people understand this topic and its implications. So thank you all very much. Goodbye.